The freedom to protest comes in conflict with the freedom to learn of other students.
If you occupy a building.
There's a conflict of those freedoms. Young people sometimes go over the line. That's part of youth, and we ought to be at the same time forgiving, but I also think it's important for them to learn to respect others.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World, the podcast about big ideas and the events that have helped shape them. I'm Christian guru-murthy, and my guest this week is one of the most influential economists in the world. Joseph Stiglitz was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors to US President Bill Clinton and chief economist at the World Bank before being awarded the Nobel Prize. His latest book is called The Road to Freedom. It explores what's gone wrong with the dominant ideology of free markets, what he terms neoliberalism. It is the rebuttal to two other Nobel Prize-winning economists of the 20th century who've become the gods of right-wing free market deregulators, Hayek and Friedman. The Road to Freedom is, of course, the counterpoint to Hayek's Road to Serfdom, and it argues a good society can be created through what he calls progressive capitalism. Professor Stiglitz is now based at Columbia University in New York, where freedom of speech and the right to protest has also been making news in recent weeks. Thank you very much for joining us.
Nice to be here.
We'll get to freedom of speech and protest in a moment, but you've got some big ideas which take on the dominant ideology of the post-war consensus.
That's right. That dominant ideology, as you mentioned, was neoliberalism, and let's parse that word out. Neo meant new, liberalism is freeing. It was an attempt to update to the 20th century the liberal ideas of the 19th century, but it wasn't really much change. And it was really a set of simple, I would say simplistic ideas that said that if you stripped away regulations, lowered taxes, let unfettered markets rip, you'd have growth, and trickle-down economics would ensure that even though a lot of the benefits of that growth would go to the top, everybody would be better off.
There is this sort of entrenched sense in all of our thinking and discourse that freeing the market in some way frees people.
That's right. And even the words that the right has used, free enterprise, free markets, suggest that there is a link between freedom and this neoliberal capitalism. And both Hayek and Friedman thought that this kind of economic freedom would not only liberate the economy and make it more efficient, perform better, but was necessary if we're going to have political freedom. One of the things I argue in the book is they were wrong both in their economics and in their politics.
I mean, it is the problem that for decades we have had these polarized views of, you can either have total freedom in which the market runs amok, or you can have communism or dictatorship. And the truth is that, you have to be somewhere in between the two.
To remind us of that, I begin by talking about the Ten Commandments, which are a set of regulations, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, that took away the freedom of the thief and the murderer, but gave the rest of society so much freedom. Now, in the 21st century, the trade-offs are a lot more subtle. Thou shalt not pollute. Pollution takes away the freedom of somebody with asthma even to live, but is putting in jeopardy our whole world. So by restricting the freedom of the polluters, we are enhancing the freedom of the rest of our society. And that's really one of the big ideas in the book, that, to put it as Isaiah Berlin, the great philosopher, put it, freedom for the wolves has often meant death for the sheep.
So does that mean you can't ever have a world in which everybody's free?
Well, you have to think very carefully about how one person's freedom impinges that of another.
It's all trade-offs.
It's not all trade-offs, because I also talk about some circumstances where a little bit of coercion
Yeah.
can actually increase everybody's freedom.
So I mean, well, just to go back a bit before that, in a way, I mean, do you believe that free markets are the road to serfdom? That they are the things that lead to people being enslaved?
What I believe is that the inequality and the deprivation that we've seen out of free markets, so-called free markets, has put us on the road to serfdom, to authoritarian, to populist. The way, let me put it a little bit more carefully, they create a fertile field. There are other factors that contribute to it, but they create a fertile field, and it's a field that demagogues will try to till, and there is, in many countries, including the United States, a rich supply of demagogues willing, and in some cases able, to till these fields, and we wound up unlucky in the United States with somebody like Donald Trump.
But isn't it also quite confusing if you're trying to understand what's going on? Because, you know, some of these right-wing populists are talking about market interventions to protect their home markets. So Trump with his protectionist ideas. Now, some of this is sort of, well, are you on the same turf? Are you talking the same language?
Yeah. So what is interesting is that the right today has abandoned neoliberalism in many essential ways while embracing it in others. And you're right, it is very confusing. They do not have a coherent intellectual philosophy. So they talk about freedom. The main extreme Republican caucus is called the Freedom Caucus in Congress, but they are perfectly willing, enthusiastic about interfering with women's right to make a choice, their reproductive rights. They're perfectly willing to interfere with other people's rights. So they don't, and they are not supportive of free trade. So they do not have a coherent philosophy today. They're opportunists, but it's exactly that opportunism that has been created by the discontent of the last 40 years of failed neoliberalism.
Well, can you also then talk about free trade? Because it is free trade. I mean, the assumption, again, is that all free trade is a good thing. And that it's part of sort of deregulation and freeing and makes everybody richer.
There was a little bit of a charade in calling all this free trade. The free trade agreements were really managed trade agreements, and they were managed for the benefit of corporate interests, multinational financial companies. So there was a little bit of a charade in calling it free trade. Example, important provision was intellectual property rights for pharmaceuticals, restricting the movement of ideas across boundaries. So it was really a managed trade regime. Interestingly, economic theory has said that while free trade could have beneficial effects so large that the winners could compensate the losers, it also said that there would be losers, and unless you provided that compensation, and unfortunately, the Republicans especially refused to provide that compensation.
Yes, so is the danger to your side of the argument, if you like, that people like Trump are saying things that are appealing to the losers right now?
They are saying things, he's a con man, and they are saying things that are attractive, but he's not delivering. He says, I feel your pain, I want to help you. And then what does he do? He wants to take away their health care. He wants to, he has a tax reform that benefits the billionaires, but not ordinary people.
But he does it in the language of saying, I'll protect your jobs.
Did he create jobs in those places where he promised? The experience has been, it was a failure. And the slogan of Trump was, make America great again. It's looking back in the past. The Biden administration has been looking forward and asking, what are the jobs for the 21st century? And it's focusing on things like chips, the green transition, It's a future-oriented industrial policy rather than trying to protect us against the changes that have already left many places behind.
Right, but aren't you also really criticizing centre-left politics as well and saying that they're not going far enough?
For the United States, one views it in a little bit of historical context. When Bill Clinton was running for the presidency, he felt that he needed to redefine where the Democratic Party was. He called it triangulation, to get more of those who were in the center and center-right on board of his agenda. And so it was a deliberate strategy of moving away from the progressive philosophy of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which had really tried to change the country with new labor legislation, Social Security. It was saying that was many years ago, a half century earlier. We have to move on. And so it was an attempt to move the Democratic Party more to the right. And I can tell you frankly, 30, 40, 30 years later, I think the country has now realized that that particular project didn't work out as well as we had hoped.
I mean, I'm obviously asking because in this country, we're looking at the Labour Party, which is in a very similar situation, is trying to win over voters from the right, is distancing itself from the philosophy of Jeremy Corbyn, which was much to the left economically, perhaps more on your turf.
He was a little bit wedded to some of the 1980s ideas, and this is 45 years later.
But are you basically warning Keir Starmer and the likes of him, I mean, not him specifically, but politicians in his place, that they are in danger of making the same mistakes?
I understand where you're beginning, and you have to get elected. But you should also realize that if you really want economic growth, you really have to make more investments in people, in R&D, in infrastructure. You can't tie your hands. It's really important to do more for the NHS. There's a broad consensus about that. But that's not only a social policy, that's a growth policy, because if you have a weak NHS, people have to wait a long time to get health care. They're out of the labor force while they're waiting. They can get depressed. There are real economic consequences from having a weak healthcare system. So I'm arguing you need a much more aggressive stance. And going forward, I believe very strongly that a green transition can be a growth-enhancing policy. Don't think about trade-offs. That's not the issue. Actually, by focusing on a green transition, you can get a better environment and faster economic growth.
Right, so what is progressive capitalism in your terms?
It's a broad concept, and I also sometimes use the word a rejuvenating social democracy. It entails a wide array of institutions. Our society is too complex to have central planning or anything like that. It's a capitalism that is regulated, competitive, works within bounds, and not just concerned with maximizing profits. It takes into account the well-being of the workers, the communities, the environment, customers. Very big departure from that shareholder value maximization that was Milton Friedman advocated. But there are other kinds of institutions that are really, really important. Government, obviously, but also other forms of collective action, unions, civil society, class action suits, and importantly, NGOs, not-for-profits.
But wouldn't all mainstream politicians in the West now say we are effectively progressive capitalists? We believe in regulation. We don't allow the market to run free without any kind of controls. We do have safety nets. We do have welfare states. So is it just a question of where you are on the line?
It is that, but as you pointed out, there is an inclination of many politicians to be not far enough not progressive enough. And there are real consequences of that. Not enough investments.
I mean, doesn't a lot of it come, though, the sort of the public skepticism about government interventions come from this idea that government doesn't do things well? You know, and in this country, people will always hark back to the 1970s and say, well, you know, we had all these nationalized industries, they were inefficient, they made a mess of everything, the trains never ran on time, and, you know, you needed competition and you needed the private sector to come and introduce some rigor into all of these things.
That's the neoliberal trope, and that's what I'm trying to fight against.
But why was it untrue?
All humans are fallible, and all human institutions are going to be fallible. And we have to take a calm look at public and private institutions. If we look at private institutions, no government has wasted money at the scale of America's private financial institutions in the years before 2008, and the consequences of their misdeeds in the years are in the trillions of dollars. The private financial sector failed. And then you start thinking about other aspects, say, of America that I know well. We have a childhood diabetes crisis caused by food companies trying to get people to consume too much sugar. Everybody has problems with their telephone company, and they're constantly complaining about their internet company. In America, where we don't have NHS, health insurance and medical care is a mess. If you're rich, you get really good care. If you're not, you know, you have my sympathy. So if you start going down the list, tobacco companies that produce addictive products without telling people, I could go on and on and on. This is not just 1% of the American economy. This is embracing a very large fraction of the private sector of the American economy. And similar things, not quite so bad in Europe, because you have, quite frankly, better regulation.
You're not denying that the public sector made a mess of things. You're saying that the private sector does too.
Yeah, and I'm also saying that the public sector has some enormous successes. We're here in part because of the government success in developing an mRNA platform that allowed for a rapid development of the vaccine. The internet is really the basis of so much of our modern society.
Government investment.
Where government, even the browser that was invented by the U.S. government.
So is it about political leadership that transforms the dominant ideology into persuading people that the state can do things?
The state can do things, and that we need a broad array of institutions. We need checks and balances. We need checks against government, and we need checks against the private sector. And when I talk about we need not only checks within the government, we need checks and balances within our society. So an important part of the checks and balances within our society, I would say, is the media. Another important part is academia, academic freedom. So we can have criticize what both the government and the private sector does, and that's what an active media does as well. But if you have too much agglomeration of wealth, that checks and balances may not work out so well.
So do you believe we are victims of a sort of a Gramsci, hegemony, a dominant ideology that is underpinned by the media and by the government, and
That's right, and I'm trying to upset that in my book. And, one book isn't going to upset it, but we need lots of conversations, and hopefully more and more people will realize the situation that we're in and say, we got to change it.
And what's your answer to the sort of, when people go, well, he's just an old lefty in a university, he doesn't run anything, he doesn't know how private sectors really work, what's your answer?
I've been engaged with the private sector. I haven't been just in an ivory tower. I spent 7-8 years of my life as a public servant, both at the Clinton administration and at the World Bank, but also been in international advisory boards of a number of big companies.
And what do you think would be the route from progressive capitalism to greater social freedoms, political freedoms, a stronger democracy?
If kids grow up in poverty, they're never going to be able to live up to their potential. They aren't really free to live up to their potential. If companies can take advantage of others, that's taking away others' freedom. So it's both public investments that expand everybody's freedom and regulations that stop anybody, including large corporations, from harming others. Right now, we have a very big problem with our social media exerting digital harms, and Europe is trying to do something about these digital harms. America has not been willing to undertake that so far. That's, I think, the way to enhance more freedom for more citizens.
The other sort of dominant ideology, if you like, of the right is that if you create these big bureaucracies, these regulatory regimes, you create monsters. You create people who abuse their power almost for the sake of it.
As I say, you need checks and balances in our society. If you think about how our standards of living are so much higher than they were 250 years ago at the time of the Enlightenment, that the ideas of science, social organization, rule of law, all those ideas about how do we organize a complex society have proven their worth.
Can we talk about freedom of speech and protest? Obviously, you're a professor at Columbia. We've seen what's been going on there in the pro-Palestinian protests there. What is your view of what's been going on and the way it's been handled by the university authorities and the police?
Most of the professors are very disturbed whenever you call in the police. Our police are sometimes a little rough. You hope you don't normally need to call in the police. But universities are special communities where we're supposed to reason together, learn. We want to protect people's freedom to speak, to debate, but also the freedom to learn. So you have these conflicts. One of the points of my book is often freedoms come in conflict. The freedom to protest comes in conflict with the freedom to learn of other students.
If you occupy a building, yeah.
And that obviously, there's a conflict of those freedoms, and I don't know all the details of what went on. I do know that there's a general sentiment that calling in the police is something of a last resort. I don't want to second guess where the negotiations were and how they were handled, but it obviously is very upsetting. But let me make two other points. One of them is that New York, Columbia University is in the midst of a city. And at the boundaries of the university, there are a lot of protesters. You can't easily separate out what's going on within the campus from what's going on outside. In my part of the campus, where my office is, total quiet. So you might not see that from looking at Hamilton Hall. So what I want to emphasize is that it's located in one particular place, a small part of a very, very large campus. The second thing I want to emphasize, to me, I feel very strong about the right to protest. I'm proud that our students feel empathy, that they're engaged in the world. I do want them to respect others. And I'm not sure, these weren't my students, but I'm not sure that all of them had that nature of the respect for others that they should have had. But protest played an important part of my own life. I was down part of the march in Washington in August 1963, Martin Luther King's famous march for civil rights, for social justice, for economics. He gave that wonderful speech, I Have a Dream. It changed the course of America.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the student leaders at the moment are talking about the Vietnam student protests and other moments that they feel. Do you feel this is such a moment and it should be respected as such? Because, there's a lot of criticism of it. There's a lot of people saying there's anti-Semitism, there's intimidation. Where do you sit in that?
Yeah, there was a really good, I thought, op-ed in the Financial Times today by Henry Luce, who tried to distinguish anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism, and the two are at risk of blending with each other, and obviously, young people sometimes go over the line. That's part of youth, and we ought to be at the same time forgiving, but say there is a line, and you can't go over that line. I worry about young people, 18 years old, getting a criminal record that will be a stain on them for the rest of their life. But I also think it's important for them to learn to respect others. I think that, unfortunately, some on the right, some Republicans, whose basic stance is anti-universities. I should make that clear. There is a strong anti-liberal education strand in the Republican Party. Speaker Johnson came up to Columbia knowing nothing about what is really going on, and on the steps of our Low Library called for the resignation of our president. We haven't had that kind of interference in academic freedom since the House Un-American Activities Committee with McCarthy back in the 50s. This is a real violation of societal norms. They've been trying to undermine our academic freedom.
So that worries you more than the protests, by the sound of it?
That worries me much more than the protests. But of course, the protests feed into that kind of attack on academic freedom. They're looking for a mechanism, a way of undermining our universities, which, remember, as I said earlier, are part of the real strength of the United States. And if they undermine our universities, they will be undermining our future leadership, intellectually, technologically, and morally.
And do your own Jewish origins influence how you feel about the issue itself that they're protesting over? Does your identity dictate how you feel about what's going on in the Middle East, or your politics?
Part of our Jewish identity is concerned about the freedom of everybody. We just celebrated Passover. It is the holiday that celebrates the freedom of the Jewish people from the slavery way back in Egypt. And I think when we have that ceremony every year, we think about the lack of freedom elsewhere, and really connects with my book. And we think about, the lack of freedom that the slaves in the United States had. And I think that's why we feel a lot more empathy for their history. And we think about the lack of freedom in every part of the world where there's been where there's been oppression.
I mean, you've advised many government institutions. I wonder whether you look at Gaza right now and think about, well, if there were ever to be a state, a new Palestinian state, it would almost, by definition, now be starting from scratch. It would be the creation of a new economy. Is that something you would be interested in helping to shape?
When I was in the World Bank, we engaged in trying to write reports about the future of a Palestinian state. That was 25 years ago, and things haven't gone well, and the challenge now is even greater. Of course, I would like to do what I could to help create a more prosperous, Palestinian state. And I think that it's only through the prosperity is an important ingredient in achieving peace in the Middle East.
Finally, if you could change the world, wave a magic wand, what would you do?
Well, I've already sort of given the answer.
The whole interview.
Progressive capitalism, rejuvenating social democracy at a very high level, the whole agenda that I talked about, public investment, good regulation, appropriate progressive taxation.
Do you think it will happen?
I'm optimistic that we are moving there. This is a moment where I would say neoliberalism is not dead, but it's in its death throes. That if you read what is going on in both the Democratic and Republican Party, the Democratic Party has moved towards industrial policies. Republican Party believes in tariffs. So neoliberalism as an ideology is being left behind because it failed. And that's why I wrote the book, because the question is, as neoliberalism dies, what's going to replace it?
Joseph Stiglitz, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.